Bourbon's story is deeply intertwined with American history, from its early production in Kentucky to its resurgence in modern times. The rich heritage of bourbon reflects the growth of the U.S., particularly in the southern states, where distilling has been a way of life for centuries. Origins of bourbon. While the exact origins of bourbon are debated, it is generally accepted that settlers in the 18th century, particularly those in Kentucky, began producing whiskey using corn, which was abundant in the region. These early distillers likely brought their knowledge of whiskey making from Europe, adapting it to the local ingredients available in the U.S. Over time, the whiskey they produced became known as bourbon, potentially named after Bourbon County, Kentucky, or Bourbon Street in New Orleans, where much of the whiskey was sold. The birth of modern bourbon. By the 19th century, bourbon had become a staple of American drinking culture. Innovations in distillation, such as the use of charred oak barrels, helped define the flavor profile of bourbon as we know it today. Distilleries began to pop up throughout Kentucky, establishing the state as the epicenter of bourbon production. Prohibition. The Prohibition era, 1920-1933, was a significant turning point for bourbon and the entire American alcohol industry. The nationwide ban on the production, sale, and distribution of alcohol had a devastating impact on distilleries. Many bourbon producers were forced to shut down, and others went out of business entirely. However, a few distilleries were able to survive by obtaining government licenses to produce whiskey for medicinal purposes. During Prohibition, whiskey could still be legally prescribed by doctors, and distilleries like Brown-Forman and Old Forester continued to operate under these licenses, keeping the bourbon tradition alive. Post-Prohibition and the Bourbon Renaissance. After Prohibition was repealed in 1933, bourbon production slowly resumed, but the industry faced a new challenge: competition from other spirits like vodka and rum. By the mid-20th century, bourbon had lost some of its popularity as lighter spirits gained favor with American consumers. However, bourbon never disappeared, and a dedicated base of enthusiasts kept the tradition alive. In recent decades, bourbon has experienced a remarkable resurgence, both in the U.S. and internationally. A growing appreciation for craft spirits and whiskey's rich history has fueled the bourbon boom, leading to increased demand for high-quality bourbons and the emergence of new distilleries. Bourbon is now one of the fastest-growing segments of the spirits market, with collectors seeking out rare bottles, limited edition releases, and single-barrel expressions. Bourbon today. Today, bourbon is a symbol of American craftsmanship and tradition. Major distilleries like Buffalo Trace, Maker's Mark, and Jim Beam continue to produce classic bourbons, while smaller craft distilleries experiment with new mash bills, aging techniques, and finishing methods. The bourbon community has expanded, with whiskey festivals, tasting events, and online forums dedicated to exploring and celebrating bourbon in all its forms. Understanding bourbon's history gives context to the drink and its cultural significance. Bourbon is more than just a whiskey. It's a reflection of American history, innovation, and resilience.